If you're over 50 and you've noticed your belly fat feels different than it used to, even though you're eating the same foods and doing the same things you always have, there is a reason for that. It's not in your head, and it's not because you've suddenly lost your willpower. Something in your body has actually changed, and once you understand what that something is, the whole picture starts to make a lot more sense. Here's what I want to walk you through today. Not a fad, not a trick, but 5 specific foods that work with the body you have right now, at this stage of life, to help address the kind of belly fat that tends to show up after 50. But before we get to the foods themselves, I want to take a few minutes to explain why this happens in the first place. Because I think that understanding changes how you approach everything that follows. Let's start there. Somewhere in our late 40s and into our 50s, our hormones begin to shift in a meaningful way. For women, the drop in estrogen that comes with perimenopause and menopause tends to change where the body stores fat, often moving it from the hips and thighs toward the abdomen. For men, a slow, steady decline in testosterone plays a similar role, nudging the body toward storing more fat around the middle, and specifically the kind of fat that sits deeper around the internal organs, which we call visceral fat. This is different from the fat just under your skin that you can pinch. Visceral fat sits further in, and it behaves differently in the body, which is part of why it tends to get more attention from researchers and doctors alike. On top of the hormone changes, there's the muscle loss that quietly happens as we age, something doctors sometimes call sarcopenia, though I promise you don't need to remember that word. What matters is simple. Muscle burns more energy than fat does, even when you're just sitting still. So as we naturally lose muscle over the years, especially if we're not doing anything to actively preserve it, our resting metabolism slows down. That means the same amount of food that once maintained your weight can now, quite literally, contribute to weight gain, particularly around the belly. And then there's insulin sensitivity, which is really just a fancy way of describing how efficiently your body uses the sugar from the food you eat. As we age, many people become somewhat less sensitive to insulin, meaning the body has to work harder to manage blood sugar, and that extra insulin circulating in your system has been associated with more fat storage, especially in the abdominal area. Put all of that together, hormone shifts, muscle loss, and changing insulin sensitivity, and you start to see why the old rules simply don't apply the same way they used to. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think it's worth being honest about something. None of what I just described, the hormone shifts, the muscle loss, the changing insulin sensitivity, is something you did wrong. These are simply the natural, expected changes that come with getting older, changes that essentially every person experiences to some degree. The frustration many people feel isn't really about the weight itself. It's about feeling like their own body has quietly changed the rules without telling them, and then feeling blamed by diet culture, by well-meaning friends, sometimes even by themselves, for not trying hard enough. I want to remove that blame from this conversation entirely, because it isn't accurate, and honestly, it isn't helpful either. Let me ask you something, and I'd like you to actually think about this rather than just nod along. Have you noticed that the diet or exercise routine that worked for you in your 30s or early 40s just doesn't produce the same results anymore? That's not a failure on your part. That's your biology sending you a very clear signal that it's time to adjust the approach, not abandon the effort altogether. Now, before we move into the foods themselves, I do want to say clearly that this video is meant for general education, and it isn't a replacement for advice from your own healthcare provider who knows your personal health history far better than any video ever could. With that said, let's talk about the 5 foods that can genuinely make a difference, starting with one that surprises a lot of people. Most people don't realize this first food can help with belly fat at all, because they think of it purely as a protein source. I'm talking about fatty fish, things like salmon, sardines, and mackerel. Here's why it matters so much after 50. Fatty fish are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, and research has looked at how these particular fats may help reduce chronic, low-grade inflammation in the body. Inflammation tends to rise gradually as we age, and some studies have connected higher inflammation levels with a greater tendency to store fat around the abdomen. Beyond that, fish is an excellent source of high-quality protein, which supports the muscle mass we just talked about, the very muscle that keeps your metabolism from slowing down further than it needs to. In simple terms, the omega-3s in fatty fish may help calm some of that background inflammation, while the protein helps your body hold onto the muscle it already has. For practical purposes, aiming for fish 2 to 3 times a week is a reasonable target for most people, and preparation matters quite a bit here. Baking, grilling, or lightly pan-searing keeps the benefits intact, while deep frying or drowning it in heavy cream sauces can undo a lot of the good this food has to offer. I remember a patient, we'll call her Diane, a woman in her late 50s who had spent most of her life eating chicken almost exclusively, because that's simply what she grew up with. When she started including salmon twice a week, nothing extreme, just a swap for one of her usual dinners, she noticed over a few months that she felt less bloated and had more steady energy through the afternoon. I want to be clear that this is one woman's experience, not a guarantee for everyone, because bodies respond differently based on genetics, activity level, and overall health. But there is something most people miss when they start adding fish into their diet, and it's this: they assume any fish counts equally. Leaner white fish like tilapia or cod are perfectly healthy, but they don't carry the same omega-3 content as fattier fish like salmon or sardines. If your goal is specifically that anti-inflammatory benefit, choosing the fattier varieties makes a real difference. Let's move to the second food, and this one might be even more important than people realize: fiber-rich legumes, things like lentils, chickpeas, and black beans. Here's the science in simple terms. Fiber slows down how quickly your body digests food, which helps you feel full for longer and helps prevent the blood sugar spikes that often lead to overeating later in the day. This ties directly back to that insulin sensitivity conversation we had earlier. Steadier blood sugar generally means less insulin circulating, and less circulating insulin tends to be more favorable for managing abdominal fat. There's also a connection between fiber and what's called the gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living in your digestive system. Some research suggests that diets richer in fiber support a more diverse and balanced population of gut bacteria, and a healthier gut environment has been associated with better metabolic outcomes overall, including how the body manages fat storage. Practically speaking, working toward around 25 to 30 grams of fiber a day is a reasonable target for most adults, and legumes are one of the easiest, most affordable ways to get there. A half cup of lentils or black beans added to a soup, a salad, or even alongside eggs at breakfast can make a real difference over time. This next food surprised many of my patients when I first brought it up, because it doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves. Leafy green vegetables, things like spinach, kale, and Swiss chard. These are low in calories but genuinely dense in nutrients, particularly magnesium, which plays a role in regulating blood sugar and, indirectly, in managing cortisol, your body's primary stress hormone. Chronically elevated cortisol has been associated in research with increased fat storage, specifically around the abdomen, which is part of why stress management isn't just good for your mental health, it's actually tied to this exact conversation about belly fat. I think of a patient, a man in his early 60s we'll call Frank, who was going through a stressful period at work and noticed his eating habits had slipped, mostly reaching for whatever was quick and easy. When he started adding a large handful of spinach or kale to his lunch and dinner, not eliminating anything else, just adding this in consistently, he found himself naturally less drawn to the processed snacks he'd been leaning on, partly because he felt more satisfied after meals. Again, this is one example meant to illustrate a principle, not a promise of identical results for everyone. Here's a mistake I see often with leafy greens, though. People assume a small side salad automatically counts as healthy, without paying attention to what's covering it. A salad drenched in a sugary, high-fat dressing can undo much of the benefit. Simple olive oil, a splash of vinegar or lemon juice that keeps the integrity of what you're actually trying to accomplish. The reason this next food matters after 50 is something nobody really talks about, and it involves plain, unsweetened Greek yogurt. I want to be very specific here, because there's an important distinction. We are not talking about the flavored, sugar-loaded yogurts that line most grocery store shelves and are marketed as healthy despite containing nearly as much sugar as a dessert. Plain Greek yogurt is high in protein, which again supports that muscle preservation we've discussed, and it contains probiotics, live bacteria that may support the same gut health conversation we touched on with fiber. Before we move on, there's one mistake I want you to avoid completely, and it's assuming that all yogurt is created equal. I'd encourage you to actually flip the container over and read the sugar content the next time you're in the grocery store. You might be genuinely surprised by what you find in something marketed with words like healthy or light right on the label. Now, before we continue to the final food, I want to take a moment to address something directly, because I think honesty matters more than hype in this space. There is a myth going around that certain foods can melt belly fat on their own, almost like flipping a switch. I want to be very clear with you. No single food, no matter how nutrient dense, will melt fat away by itself. What foods like the ones we're discussing today can do is support a body that's also getting enough movement, enough sleep, and reasonable stress management. If someone promises you an instant fix from a single ingredient, I'd encourage you to be skeptical, because that's simply not how the body works. Let's talk about the fifth and final food, because I think it ties everything together nicely. Berries, things like blueberries, raspberries, and blackberries. Berries are relatively low in sugar compared to most fruits. They're high in fiber, and they're rich in antioxidant compounds called polyphenols. Researchers have been exploring how these polyphenols may interact with fat cells and metabolic processes, though I want to be careful to say this is an active area of ongoing research rather than settled, guaranteed science. What we can say with more confidence is that berries offer a naturally sweet way to satisfy a craving without the blood sugar spike you'd get from something like a pastry, and stable blood sugar, as we've discussed throughout this video, is closely tied to how the body manages fat around the middle. I think of a patient, a woman in her late 50s, we'll call Carol, who loved something sweet after dinner every night and had a hard time giving that up, which is completely understandable. Instead of eliminating that ritual entirely, which tends to backfire for most people, she swapped her usual dessert for a bowl of mixed berries with a small amount of plain Greek yogurt, essentially combining two of the foods we've already talked about. She kept the comfort and the routine she enjoyed, but changed what filled it. And that kind of substitution tends to be far more sustainable than sheer willpower alone. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on something just as important as the foods themselves, and that's the mistakes I see people make even when they're trying hard to do the right thing. The first mistake is eating healthy foods, but still leaving too much room in the diet for processed foods, chips, crackers, sugary drinks, things that quietly add up even when the main meals look reasonable. The second mistake is not getting enough protein throughout the day, which makes it much harder to preserve muscle, especially after 50, when your body needs more protein than it did in your 20s or 30s just to maintain the same amount of muscle mass. The third mistake is ignoring strength training entirely. Many people focus purely on cardio, walking or cycling, which is genuinely valuable. But resistance training, even something as simple as light dumbbells or resistance bands twice a week, is one of the most direct ways to preserve and even rebuild the muscle that supports your metabolism. The fourth mistake is poor sleep, something people often underestimate. Poor sleep has been associated with higher levels of the hunger hormone ghrelin and lower levels of leptin, the hormone that signals fullness, which means when you're not sleeping well, your body tends to push you toward eating more, often the exact kind of processed, high-sugar foods that work against everything else you're trying to do. The fifth mistake is extreme dieting, cutting calories too aggressively or eliminating entire food groups. This often backfires, slowing metabolism further and making the whole process feel unsustainable within a matter of weeks. And the sixth mistake, the one I really want to drive home today, is expecting one single food to magically burn fat on its own. Foods are tools, not miracles. They work best as part of a broader, consistent pattern, not as an isolated fix. Before we move into lifestyle, I want to add one more layer to that insulin sensitivity conversation from earlier, because I think it helps explain why some of these mistakes matter so much more after 50 than they did when you were younger. When you were in your 20s or 30s, your body could often absorb an occasional poor food choice, a sugary dessert, a skipped workout, a late night, without much visible consequence. Your metabolic system had more flexibility, more room to compensate. After 50, that flexibility narrows somewhat. The same occasional poor choice tends to show up more clearly, whether that's in your blood sugar readings, your energy levels, or yes, around your midsection. This isn't meant to discourage you. I actually find it clarifying, because it means the changes you make now carry more weight in a good way. Small, Consistent improvements tend to produce more noticeable results after 50 than they might have decades ago, precisely because your body is paying closer attention to every input you give it. I also want to spend a moment on something that ties several of these mistakes together, and that's the idea of all or nothing thinking. I've seen so many people do wonderfully for 2 or 3 weeks, eating well, moving more, sleeping better, and then one difficult week throws everything off. A holiday, a family stressor, an illness, and they treat that one setback as proof the whole effort failed. That thinking pattern is, in my experience, one of the biggest obstacles to real progress. One difficult week doesn't erase 3 good ones. The goal was never perfection in the first place. It was building a pattern that you can return to again and again, even after it gets interrupted. Let's briefly touch on lifestyle, because food alone isn't the entire picture, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I pretended otherwise. Walking regularly, even just 20 to 30 minutes a day, supports metabolic health in ways that go beyond simple calorie burning. Resistance training, as I mentioned, helps preserve the muscle that keeps your metabolism working efficiently. Sleep, ideally 7 to 8 hours most nights, supports the hormone balance we discussed earlier. And stress management, whether that's through breathing exercises, time outdoors, or simply setting boundaries around what drains your energy, plays a real role in managing cortisol and, by extension, abdominal fat storage. I'm not asking you to turn your life into a full fitness regimen. I'm simply asking you to see these pieces as connected, because they are. Here's a question I'd like you to sit with for a moment. Of everything we've covered today, hormones, muscle, insulin sensitivity, the 5 foods, and the lifestyle pieces, which single change feels the most realistic for you to start this week? I ask because I've found over and over that people who succeed aren't the ones trying to change everything at once. They're the ones who pick one specific, doable change and let it become a genuine habit before adding the next one on top of it. If there's one thing I want you to walk away with today, it's this. The belly fat that shows up after 50 is not a personal failure, and it's not a sign that you've lost control of your body. It's your body responding to real, measurable shifts in hormones, muscle mass, and metabolism. Shifts that happen to nearly everyone at this stage of life. And just as those shifts are real and measurable, so are the changes you can make in response. This isn't about chasing the body you had 30 years ago. It's about supporting the body you have right now with patience, consistency, and the right information, rather than fighting against it with quick fixes that were never designed for where you are today. I'd genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Which of these 5 foods are you already eating regularly, and which one will you add this week? I read through the comments often, and honestly, some of the most valuable insight on this channel comes from people sharing what's actually worked in their own lives, not just what a study says on paper. Aging doesn't mean giving up, and it doesn't mean your best years for feeling strong and healthy are behind you. Small, consistent changes really do add up over time, even when the progress feels slow week to week. If today's video helped you understand your body a little better, there's a related topic I think you'll find just as useful about how sleep quality connects to this exact same belly fat conversation in ways most people never consider. Take care of yourself, be patient with the process, and I'll see you in the next one.